Picture yourself as a newborn human. You can't lift your own head, you can't crawl, let alone walk. Feeding yourself isn't an option, and neither is keeping your body warm without help. You have zero concept of danger, but every predator nearby already knows exactly what you are. At roughly 3 kilograms, soft, slow, and defenseless, you're about as vulnerable as a mammal can possibly be. And yet, here you are. That means every single person in your bloodline, going back tens of thousands of generations, somehow managed to keep something this fragile breathing. Not just once, over and over, for around 300,000 years straight, without a single break in the chain. So this isn't just a curious historical question, it's personal. One failure, just one, anywhere along that line, and you simply wouldn't exist to be watching this right now. A little unsettling, honestly. But here's what makes this genuinely fascinating. Keeping a baby that helpless alive wasn't down to luck, or a handful of clever tricks passed from parent to parent. It required an entire social system built around that one fragile life. A system so effective that once you understand it, it starts to explain why so many parents today feel exhausted, isolated, and like they're failing at something that used to be shared by many hands, not just 2. Before we get into how they solved it, quick favor. If channels like this one interest you, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this kind of research-based content keep getting made, and there's a lot more coming. Now, let's start with the question almost nobody stops to ask. Why is human birth so difficult to begin with? Take a zebra foal. Within 20 minutes of birth, it's standing. Within an hour, it can run alongside the herd, fast enough to outpace a hyena if it has to. Nature hands most mammals a survival manual the moment they're born. Human babies get nothing like that. It takes about a year just to walk, longer to run. And that's not a design flaw. It's the price of the human brain. Here's the tension your ancestors were born into. A newborn skull has to fit through the mother's pelvis, but the pelvis can only be so wide before walking upright becomes difficult, even dangerous. Scientists call this the obstetric dilemma, a straightforward trade-off between having a big enough brain to survive as a species and a small enough head to survive birth itself. The compromise evolution landed on is called secondary altriciality. Essentially, humans are born unfinished. Instead of staying inside until the brain and body are ready, like a horse or a deer, human babies are delivered early while there's still time to squeeze through. The rest of that development, the part other animals finish before birth, happens outside the womb, in the open, completely exposed. Which means every single one of your ancestors was born mid-construction, not ready, not equipped, and entirely dependent on someone else to survive the gap. So the real question was never, how does one mother manage this alone? Because she doesn't. The moment a species starts giving birth to unfinished infants, survival stops being a personal problem and becomes a group problem. This is where something called cooperative breeding comes in. And "it takes a village" isn't a nice phrase here. It's closer to a biological requirement. Consider this. Human females routinely live decades after they're no longer able to have children. That's genuinely rare in the animal kingdom. Most species don't get a post-reproductive stage at all. Biologically, once reproduction stops, there's little evolutionary reason to stick around. So why did human grandmothers? Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes proposed an answer in the 1990s, now known as the grandmother hypothesis. Older women who could no longer have children of their own didn't fade into the background. They redirected all of that energy into their grandchildren, gathering food, watching toddlers, freeing up mothers to have their next child sooner. In this model, grandmothers didn't just help. Their presence appears to have measurably raised the odds that grandchildren survived. And it didn't stop with grandmothers. Among the Aka people of Central Africa, researchers have found fathers stay in close physical contact with infants for roughly 47% of the day, an extraordinarily high figure by global standards. Aunts, uncles, older siblings, even unrelated adults in the group, all folded into the same task. Here's the thing worth sitting with. We talk about survival of the fittest like it's about the strongest individual. But an infant this helpless was never going to be saved by one strong person. It was saved by how many hands were willing to reach out. The fittest weren't the toughest bodies. They were the ones embedded in the thickest web of support. That support showed up literally at the breast. Hunter-gatherer mothers breastfed for 2 to 4 years, often nursing every couple of hours around around the clock, frequent enough that it naturally suppressed ovulation, spacing pregnancies out by 3 to 4 years. It wasn't planning, it was biology doing the spacing for you. But breastfeeding wasn't always a one-woman job either. If a mother fell ill, lost her milk, or died, another nursing woman in the group would often step in without hesitation, a practice known as wet nursing. A baby's survival was never resting on the health of a single body. It was distributed quietly across every lactating woman in camp, which meant one mother's worst day didn't have to become her infant's last one. Now think practically for a moment. You're a hunter-gatherer mother, and gathering food doesn't wait. You have to walk for miles through open terrain, often with predators nearby, and you can't exactly leave a newborn behind. So you bring it with you, strapped against your body, hands-free, moving at full speed. This wasn't a parenting style. It was a solution to 3 overlapping threats at once. A baby left alone, even briefly, could lose body heat fast in the open. A crying infant could draw the attention of exactly the kind of animal you didn't want circling your camp. And a baby carried against a moving body simply had far better odds than one left stationary and exposed. The evidence that this constant contact mattered isn't just logical guesswork either. It shows up on 3 different levels. Newborns are born with a strong grasping reflex, strong enough to support their own weight briefly. A leftover trait many researchers link to a deep evolutionary history of infants clinging to a caregiver's body. On a neurological level, skin-to-skin contact has been shown to help regulate a baby's heart rate and breathing, essentially borrowing the stability of an adult body until the infant's own systems mature. And across cultures, studies comparing carried infants to non-carried infants have found carried babies cry noticeably less, in some research by around half. Compare that to a lot of modern infant care, where babies spend long stretches in cribs, bouncers, or strollers at a physical distance from a caregiver's body that would have been almost unthinkable for most of human history. That's not a judgment. Modern life simply makes constant carrying difficult. But it's worth noticing just how recent that distance actually is. Once a baby survived infancy, the next challenge was food. And this is where ancient parenting gets genuinely strange by modern standards. Long before store-bought purees, caregivers used a method called pre-mastication, chewing food themselves first, softening it, then passing it to the infant. Bone marrow was another prized early food, soft, calorie-dense, and easy for a toothless mouth to manage. Beyond that, diets for young children were remarkably varied. Soft plant matter, mashed tubers, whatever the group's environment provided that day. And here's the detail that tends to surprise people. When researchers examine ancient teeth, children raised in hunter-gatherer groups often show fewer cavities than children from early agricultural societies, who leaned heavily on soft, starchy, cultivated grains. In other words, the primitive diet may have quietly outperformed one of the first major upgrades in human food history. Turns out variety beats convenience, even 20,000 years ago. Then came nightfall, and with it, one more decision every caregiver had to make. For roughly 99% of human history, the answer was simple. Everyone slept together. Co-sleeping wasn't a choice weighed against alternatives. There essentially weren't alternatives. A separate, silent room for an infant would have meant no one there to notice if something went wrong. Researcher James McKenna has studied this extensively, and his work suggests something worth taking seriously, though carefully. His research proposes that close nighttime contact with a caregiver may help regulate an infant's breathing and arousal patterns, and some researchers have linked this to lower risk factors associated with SIDS. It's important to say clearly, this is an area of ongoing research, not a settled conclusion, and it isn't offered here as medical advice. But it does suggest that sleeping close to a caregiver may have done more than simply feel comforting. It may have been doing quiet physiological work the whole night through. Carried by day, fed by many hands, sleeping within arm's reach by night. And even with every one of these systems running at once, working exactly as they'd worked for hundreds of thousands of years, survival was still nowhere near guaranteed. Which raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. If all of this was in place, just how many children didn't make it? Here's the number that should stop you for a second. Best estimates place child mortality somewhere between 30 and 50% in Paleolithic and early Neolithic populations. Nearly 1 in every 2 or 3 children never reached their 5th birthday. That figure isn't evidence that ancient parents cared less. It's evidence of what they were up against. No germ theory, no antibiotics, no vaccines, none of the tools that have driven child mortality down by roughly 96% since the year 1800. They were fighting invisible enemies with visible tools. And some of those tools worked far better than you'd expect. Take willow bark. Long before anyone understood chemistry, people across multiple ancient cultures had already identified that chewing or brewing it eased pain and brought down fever. It would eventually become the basis for aspirin, one of the most widely used medicines on Earth. That's not folklore stumbled into by accident, it's generations of careful, repeated observation, tested on real children, passed down because it actually worked. Nobody had a laboratory. What they had was thousands of years of trial and memory, refined into something genuinely functional. None of it could touch bacterial meningitis or severe dehydration, but it wasn't nothing either. And alongside the medicine, every human culture on record developed rituals around birth and early childhood. Namings, protective charms, ceremonies marking each stage a child survived. It's tempting to write these off as superstition, but look closer, and they were doing real work, publicly tying the whole community to that child's well-being, and giving people a shared structure to lean on when a child didn't make it. Because grief was real. The archaeological record makes that unmistakable. Infant burials have been found carefully arranged, small bodies positioned with visible care, sometimes surrounded by grave goods, sometimes with flowers laid beside them. Whatever else was different about life 20,000 years ago, indifference to a child's death was not part of it. They tried, they grieved, and slowly, generation after generation, they got a little better at holding on to the next one. Now here's the part of the story most people don't see coming. A surprising amount of what ancient humans did to keep children alive actually outperformed what replaced it. Not the medicine, let's be completely clear about that. Vaccines, sanitation, modern healthcare, none of that is up for debate. The collapse of child mortality over the past century stands as one of the great achievements in human history, full stop. Nobody sensible wants to return to a world where half of all children die young. But there's a second category here. Not medical treatment, but the everyday behavioral environment surrounding a child. The carrying, the shared care, the constant presence of other bodies nearby. And in that category, something genuinely seems to have been lost along the way. For most of human history, child rearing was distributed. Grandmothers, aunts, uncles, older kids, unrelated adults, all sharing the weight of one fragile life. Today, that network has largely been replaced by two exhausted adults, often living far from extended family, sometimes almost entirely on their own. Constant physical contact has given way to bouncers, swings, and playpens, devices built specifically to keep a baby content without anyone having to hold it. Shared sleep has given way to the solitary nursery, alongside a modern discomfort with dependence that, from an evolutionary standpoint, is honestly a little strange. None of this happened because anyone decided child welfare mattered less. It happened because of urbanization, two-income households, and the quiet erosion of extended family living nearby. Changes that were never really about children at all. And the parents navigating the aftermath are, for the most part, doing everything they can within a structure that was never designed to support one or two people alone, which might be worth remembering next time a modern parent feels like they're falling short. Rates of postpartum depression, infant sleep struggles, and parental burnout in industrialized countries aren't small or rare. They're well documented, and they're common. That's not a personal failing. It's what happens when you take a job that evolved to be shared among a dozen people and hand it to two. The ancient answer to keeping a child alive was never be strong enough to do it yourself. It was don't do it yourself. Share the exhaustion, spread the risk, make sure no single person is ever the one thing standing between a child and disaster. That wasn't a parenting philosophy, it was survival infrastructure, and somewhere along the way, we quietly took it apart. So strip it all back and the picture becomes simple. Grandmothers who redirected decades of their lives toward grandchildren instead of stepping aside. Mothers who were never the only ones able to feed a child. Bodies kept warm against other bodies, day and night, so no infant was ever truly alone in the open. Communities that mourned together when a child was lost and quietly got better at preventing the next loss. None of that was any single person's responsibility. All of it was shared, spread across grandmothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, older siblings, even unrelated adults in the group. That's the real answer to how ancient humans kept children alive. Not one hero, not one perfect caregiver, a whole structure built so that no single failure could end a child's life. Go back to where this video started. A newborn who can't walk, can't feed itself, can't survive a single cold night without help, and has absolutely no defense against a predator that already knows exactly what it is. And somehow, an unbroken line of ancestors stretching back roughly 300,000 years managed to carry that impossibly fragile creature all the way to adulthood, every single time. Not once in that entire chain did it fail completely. It wasn't because any one of those ancestors was uniquely strong, uniquely smart, or uniquely lucky. It was because none of them ever had to face the problem by themselves. Every generation was caught, quite literally, by the hands surrounding it. Hands that fed, carried, warmed, and watched through the night. Multiply that across hundreds of thousands of years, and you get the only explanation that actually makes sense for why there was always a next generation. You're not sitting here right now because one ancestor was tough enough to survive on their own. You're here because generation after generation, an entire network refused to let a single child slip through. That network is the real reason this chain never broke. Not once, not ever, all the way down to you. And that's worth sitting with for a second, because it means survival at its core was never really about the individual. It was about connection. It still is. If this kind of deep dive into the real, researched history behind human behavior is something you want more of, subscribe now. This channel is built entirely on stories like this one, and there's a lot more of that chain still waiting to be uncovered.